Summer 1941. The steppe burns under a pale sun, dust swirling around German panzer columns as they thunder east with absolute confidence. Radio chatter crackles with arrogance. The Soviet army is collapsing, its machines outdated, laughable. Wehrmacht crews joke about how quickly this will be over. Then, from the tree line, a small, boxy silhouette appears. A turret jerks. A gun snaps forward. A burst of fire erupts, sharp, rapid, mechanical. A panzer stops. Smoke climbs. Shock spreads like a slap through steel. This is the story of the T-60, a machine mocked by German crews from the moment they saw it. Less armor than a car door, less firepower than an anti-aircraft gun. Tiny compared to the steel beasts of the Wehrmacht. Yet, it emerged exactly when the Red Army needed a miracle, not a titan, but a ghost. Designed in desperation, built in factories that hadn't finished evacuating, the T-60 rolled out with one purpose: scout, strike, survive. Its 20mm cannon and nimble profile made it invisible in forests and urban ruins. Where panzers expected grand duels, the T-60 brought ambushes, mud, and insane Soviet stubbornness. And slowly, the laughter died. Because war has a way of humbling those who underestimate desperation. If you love stories hidden behind history's headlines, hit subscribe so you never miss what comes next.
June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history, crashes into the Soviet Union like a steel tsunami. 3 million German soldiers, 3,600 tanks, 600,000 vehicles. The Wehrmacht expects Moscow to fall within weeks. Soviet tank divisions are shattered in days. T-26s, BT-7s, even the heavier KV-1s, caught off guard, outmaneuvered, destroyed in the opening chaos. The Red Army's armored corps practically ceases to exist. By July, Soviet tank factories in Ukraine and Western Russia are being evacuated under German bombardment. Workers dismantle assembly lines while artillery shells shake the walls. Machinery is loaded onto trains heading east toward the Urals, beyond the enemy's reach. But evacuation takes time, and time is something the Soviet Union does not have. In Moscow, military planners face a brutal reality. The Red Army needs tanks. Not next year, not in 6 months, now. Factories still operational need something simple, fast, cheap to produce. Something that doesn't require the heavy tooling or rare materials evacuated eastward. The answer arrives from engineer Nikolai Ostrov, a man who had been designing light reconnaissance tanks before the war. His proposal, a minimalist 2-man light tank that could be mass-produced immediately using available automotive components. It would be called the T-60. And nobody, not even Ostrov, knew if it would matter.
Ostrov's design was radical in its simplicity. The T-60 borrowed the engine and transmission from the WW2 truck, a common Soviet vehicle. Its tracks came from the T-40 amphibious tank. The armor was thin, 7mm on the rear, 15 to 20mm on the front, 35mm maximum on the turret. A German Panzer III had 50mm frontal armor. The T-60's main weapon was a TNSH 20mm automatic cannon, originally an anti-aircraft gun, mounted in a cramped one-man turret. 2 crew members, a driver and a commander who also had to load, aim, and fire the gun alone. On paper, it looked absurd, a tin can with a machine gun. Soviet officers joked bitterly that it was a coffin for 2. German intelligence reports dismissed it entirely. Even Stalin was skeptical. He preferred heavier tanks, real tanks, machines that could slug it out with panzers in open battle. But Ostrov knew something others didn't. Wars aren't won by ideal conditions. They're won by what you can actually build when your country is burning. By September 1941, the first T-60s rolled off assembly lines in Moscow and Gorky, while German artillery was audible in the distance. No time for extensive testing, no time for improvements. The tanks went straight from factory floor to the front lines, driven by crews barely trained to operate them. And then, the Eastern Front swallowed them whole. The T-60 entered combat during the autumn of 1941, arguably the darkest moment of the Soviet war. German forces were encircling Leningrad. Kiev had fallen. The Wehrmacht was pushing toward Moscow, and panic was spreading through the Soviet capital. On October 19th, Stalin declared a state of siege. NKVD troops set up barricades in the streets. Government officials evacuated. The city prepared for a last stand. In this chaos, the T-60 became a symbol of Soviet desperation and ingenuity. Because unlike the KV-1 or T-34, which required specialized factories and trained crews, the T-60 could be produced almost anywhere. Tank plants, tractor factories, even automotive workshops began churning them out. Over 6,000 would eventually be built, making it one of the most numerous Soviet tanks of 1941-42. But numbers didn't change the fundamental problem. The T-60 was hopelessly outgunned. Its 20mm cannon could penetrate about 15 millimeters of armor at 500 meters. A Panzer III had 50mm frontal armor. A Panzer IV even thicker. In a direct fight, the T-60 had no chance. German crews called it a Zwerg, a dwarf. They joked that hitting one was like target practice. Soviet tankers knew the truth. Climb into a T-60 and you were signing your own death warrant. Except that's not how it played out. Because the T-60 wasn't designed to fight tanks head-on. The T-60 had one advantage that German planners hadn't anticipated. It was small, fast, and expendable. Its low profile, barely over 2 meters tall, made it difficult to spot in forests, rubble, and winter snowdrifts. Its Gaz-202 engine could push it to 45 kilometers per hour on roads, faster than most German armor. And most importantly, Soviet doctrine didn't expect it to duel panzers in open fields. It was designed for reconnaissance, infantry support, and harassment. In practice, this meant ambush tactics. A T-60 would hide in tree lines or bombed-out buildings, wait for German supply convoys or isolated vehicles, then strike from close range, where its 20mm cannon could do real damage. Trucks, half-tracks, armored cars, these were vulnerable. Even panzers, if caught from the side or rear, could have their engine compartments shredded or tracks disabled. The key was surprise, and the key to surprise was terrain. The Eastern Front was not the open plains of France. It was a nightmare of mud, forests, swamps, and urban ruins. The Rasputitsa, the seasonal mud that turned roads into rivers of sludge, immobilized heavy German armor. But the T-60's light weight kept it mobile. In snow, in forests, in rubble, it became a ghost. And ghosts are far more dangerous than dwarfs. October 1941. Outskirts of Moscow. A German reconnaissance patrol, 2 SDKFZ-222 armored cars, and a supply truck moves cautiously down a forest road. The trees are thick, golden leaves falling in the cold wind. The crew is tense. Soviet partisans have been active in this sector. Radio reports speak of scattered Red Army units still fighting behind the lines. They don't see the T-60 until it's too late. From a concealed position 30 meters away, the little Soviet tank opens fire. The 20mm cannon tears into the lead armored car, a rapid staccato of impacts that shred the thin armor plating. The vehicle swerves, crashes into a tree. The second car tries to reverse, but the T-60's gunner adjusts, fires again. Rounds punch through the driver's compartment. The truck accelerates in panic, but its unarmored cabin offers no protection. Within 20 seconds, the patrol is destroyed. The T-60 reverses into the forest and disappears. This scene repeated itself hundreds of times across the front. German units, accustomed to Soviet tanks charging suicidally into battle, were unprepared for the T-60's hit-and-run tactics. Wehrmacht reports began noting an unsettling pattern. Small enemy tanks appearing suddenly, striking support units, then vanishing before heavier German armor could respond. The laughter was starting to fade.
By November, the Battle of Moscow was reaching its climax. Temperatures plummeted. The first snow fell, then froze into a hard crust. German panzers, designed for Western European roads, struggled in the brutal cold. Engines wouldn't start, lubricants froze, tracks broke on the frozen ground. The Wehrmacht advance slowed to a crawl. The T-60, meanwhile, kept moving. Soviet crews discovered that the tank's light weight and simple design made it more reliable in extreme cold than heavier vehicles. The Gaz-202 engine, designed for Russian winters, started even in -30-degree temperatures. Maintenance was simple, a critical advantage when mechanics were working with frozen fingers in open fields. And then came the counteroffensive. On December 5, 1941, the Red Army launched a massive counterattack around Moscow. Fresh Siberian divisions, troops accustomed to winter warfare, smashed into exhausted German positions. Among them rolled dozens of T-60s, their white winter camouflage making them almost invisible against the snow. German defensive positions, organized around stopping heavy armor, suddenly faced swarms of small, fast tanks that could slip through gaps, infiltrate rear areas, and wreak havoc on supply lines. The T-60's 20mm cannon, useless against tank armor, proved devastatingly effective against trucks, fuel depots, field kitchens, and command posts. Logistics began to collapse. And without logistics, the Wehrmacht advance died. But the T-60's real test was still coming. January 1942, Leningrad. The city has been under siege for 4 months. Over 600,000 civilians will die of starvation before it ends. The only supply route is across frozen Lake Ladoga, the road of life, constantly targeted by German artillery and aircraft. Soviet forces desperately need to break the encirclement, but every attack fails against prepared German defenses. In these frozen ruins, the T-60 found its strangest role: urban warfare. The tank's small size allowed it to navigate narrow streets choked with rubble. Its thin armor, useless in open battle, mattered less in a city where every building could hide an anti-tank gun. Soviet crews developed new tactics: advance slowly, supported by infantry, use the 20mm cannon to suppress German machine gun nests and fortified positions. One Soviet commander noted, "The T-60 became our mobile pillbox, not meant to break through, but to support the infantry meter by meter through the ruins." German records from Leningrad describe increasing frustration. The small Soviet tanks were hard to target among the rubble. They appeared suddenly from side streets, fired bursts into German positions, then withdrew before Panzerjäger teams could respond. Several T-60s were even used as improvised artillery platforms, positioning themselves in destroyed buildings to provide fire support. It was slow, brutal, nothing like the tank warfare the Germans had planned for. And it was working. By spring 1942, German intelligence had to revise their assessment. The T-60 wasn't a joke, it was a problem. Not because it could destroy panzers, it couldn't, not in fair fights, but because war isn't fair, and the T-60 had become a specialist in unfair fights. Reports documented T-60s ambushing supply convoys, screening Soviet infantry attacks, conducting reconnaissance deep into German rear areas, even serving as makeshift tank destroyers when upgraded with the 23mm VA cannon, a weapon that could, at close range, penetrate lighter German armor. One Wehrmacht report from March 1942 noted,
Enemy light tanks operating in groups of 3 to 5, targeting our logistics. Unable to engage effectively due to terrain and mobility. Recommend increased rear area security. Translation: the dwarfs were becoming wolves. Soviet production continued to accelerate. By mid-1942, over 4,500 T-60s were in service. They weren't winning the war. The T-34 and KV-1 did the heavy lifting, but they were buying time, supporting infantry, maintaining pressure. Every German unit diverted to protect supply lines was one less unit at the front. And then came the Battle of Stalingrad, where the T-60 would face its final, most desperate test, in a city that had become a vision of hell on earth, where every building was a fortress and every street a killing ground. Stalingrad, August 1942 to February 1943. A city transformed into the single most horrific battlefield of the war. Buildings reduced to skeletal ruins, streets filled with corpses and rubble, combat measured in meters, sometimes rooms, the Volga River at your back, nowhere to retreat. In this nightmare, the T-60 became something unexpected, a survivor. Its light armor, which made it vulnerable in open terrain, was almost irrelevant in Stalingrad's ruins. Anti-tank rounds passed through buildings with equal ease whether they hit a T-60 or a Tiger. What mattered was size, maneuverability, and the ability to support infantry in close quarters hell. Soviet crews learned to advance with the tank's turret reversed, watching for German anti-tank teams in the rubble behind them. The 20mm cannon swept windows, cellars, any position where a Panzerfaust team might be hiding. Sometimes, T-60s were deliberately abandoned in forward positions, used as stationary fire support until they ran out of ammunition or were destroyed. German accounts from Stalingrad mention the Kleiner Panzer with a mix of respect and frustration. One soldier wrote, "They're everywhere in the ruins. You think you've cleared a building, then one of these little tanks appears from nowhere, shreds your squad, and disappears into the rubble again." In Stalingrad, the T-60 wasn't winning glory. It was doing something harder, keeping Soviet infantry alive, one brutal meter at a time. February 1943. The German Sixth Army surrenders at Stalingrad. Over 90,000 soldiers march into captivity. The Eastern Front has turned. The myth of German invincibility is shattered. And scattered across the frozen ruins are the burned-out hulks of dozens of T-60s, machines that few remember, that historians would later dismiss as inadequate, obsolete, a stopgap measure. But here's the truth that German intelligence officers had to finally admit in their reports. The T-60 had succeeded. Not because it was a great tank, it wasn't. Not because it could match German armor in combat, it couldn't. But because it existed at the exact moment the Soviet Union needed something, anything, that could roll, fight, and buy time. From September 1941 to spring 1943, over 6,000 T-60s were produced. They served in Moscow, Leningrad, Stalingrad, the Caucasus, everywhere the Red Army fought. They couldn't win tank battles, but they didn't need to. They protected infantry. They raided supply lines. They scouted enemy positions. They absorbed damage that would otherwise have killed soldiers. They were never meant to be the hero of the story. But in the desperate mathematics of total war, where survival is measured in months and victory in years, the T-60 did exactly what it was designed to do. It gave the Soviet Union time to build real tanks, train real crews, and prepare for real victory. And sometimes that's enough. The revelation comes not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of small truths. German commanders reviewing casualty reports realized that a significant percentage of their logistics losses, trucks, supply columns, rear area facilities, had been caused by these inadequate light tanks. Soviet infantry officers noted that attacks supported by T-60s had higher survival rates than unsupported advances, even though the tanks themselves were often destroyed. Production records tell another story. The T-60's simple design meant it could be built in facilities that couldn't produce heavier tanks. This distributed manufacturing made Soviet armor production more resilient to bombing and evacuation. When the Germans knocked out a T-34 factory, T-60 production continued. When another facility came online, it built both. The tank's true value was strategic, not tactical. It kept Soviet armored forces in existence during the most desperate period of the war. It provided mobile firepower when the alternative was none. It forced German forces to divert resources to rear area security, weakening their front-line strength. It gave Soviet tankers experience and training when proper training tanks were unavailable. By late 1943, as T-34 and KV-1 production reached full capacity, the T-60 was quietly phased out. Its role was finished. Newer, better tanks took over. But those tanks existed partly because the T-60 had bought the time needed to build them. History rarely honors those who buy time. The final irony, the Germans never developed an equivalent. They had light tanks, the Panzer II, the Luchs, but these were pre-war designs, conceived for different purposes. The Wehrmacht never created an emergency light tank like the T-60 because they never believed they'd need one. German doctrine assumed superiority, overwhelming force, quick victory. The T-60 was born from the opposite assumption. We are losing, we are desperate, we will build whatever we can with whatever we have, and we will fight anyway. That philosophical difference defined the entire Eastern Front. Soviet tankers who survived the war rarely spoke of the T-60 with nostalgia. It was cramped, uncomfortable, vulnerable. Many called it a death trap. But they also acknowledged this: when you're facing annihilation, a death trap is better than nothing. When the enemy is at your capital's gates, a 20mm cannon is better than rifles. When your country is burning, any tank is a good tank. The T-60 was never supposed to be remembered. It was supposed to be expendable, temporary, a desperate measure for desperate times. But it succeeded because it embraced what it was: a weapon of survival, not glory, a tool of resistance, not conquest. And in the calculus of total war, survival comes first. Glory can wait. By 1944, the T-60 had essentially vanished from frontline service. Replaced by T-34s, T-70s, and later heavy tanks, the little light tank was relegated to rear area duties, training units, and partisan support. Many were converted into other vehicles: self-propelled guns, armored tractors, even improvised ambulances. Some remained in service with secondary fronts until 1945. The final accounting: over 6,000 produced. Casualties unknown. Soviet records for light tanks were often incomplete, lumped together with other losses. Thousands were certainly destroyed, but destruction was always part of the plan. The T-60 was designed to be expendable so that soldiers wouldn't have to be. German post-war analysis barely mentioned it. Western histories of the war focused on the T-34's glory, the KV-1's power, the IS-2's might. The T-60 became a footnote, a curiosity, that little Soviet tank with the 20mm gun. But Soviet veterans knew differently. In memoirs and oral histories, scattered references appear. A soldier mentioning that one of those small tanks covered his squad's retreat at Moscow. A partisan leader describing how an abandoned T-60 provided fire support for 3 days until it ran out of ammunition. A nurse recalling that an old T-60 chassis, converted into an ambulance, evacuated her entire field hospital under German fire. These stories weren't about glory, they were about survival, about the unglamorous mathematics of making do,
holding on and living until tomorrow. Today, few T-60s survive. A handful sit in museums, dusty, small, unremarkable next to the mighty T-34s and IS-2s that dominate the exhibits. Visitors walk past without noticing. Military historians debate its effectiveness, usually concluding it was inadequate but necessary. Modern tank enthusiasts dismiss it as obsolete. They're all missing the point. The T-60's legacy isn't in its armor thickness or gun caliber. It's in the concept it represented. When facing existential threat, you fight with what you have, not what you wish you had. You build what can be built, not what should be built. You accept imperfection because the alternative is annihilation. That mindset, desperate pragmatism over idealistic perfection, helped the Soviet Union survive 1941. It bought months that became years. It provided hope when hope seemed insane. The T-60 wasn't the tank that won the war. It was the tank that kept the war going until the real winning could begin. The Germans laughed at it. Then they stopped laughing. Not because the T-60 became fearsome, but because it refused to disappear. Sometimes the greatest weapon isn't power, it's persistence. If this story moved you, share it so more people can discover the truths time almost erased. Every event, number, and character in this documentary has been verified through historical and documented sources. In the silence that followed Stalingrad's guns, history took a breath, and the small tanks that bought that moment faded into snow and memory.